works alone, his hands defiling the bodies of the dead in his thirst for knowledge and power. His name is Adam Crowley, a man who was once respected in the field of science, until fate led him along another path, towards black magic. Now he is in possession of the mythical Lost Diary of Samuel Pepys, a volume that contains the detestable rituals of the demon-worshipping Brotherhood of Hecate. Soon, he will complete his work. Tonight, as the sun sets on London one last time, he will unleash his demonic brood onto the streets. And should no one stop him, this city will be consumed by a horde of nightmare creatures.
Nightmare Creatures is a survival horror beat-em-up style video game developed by Kalisto Entertainment in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. The game also released on Microsoft Windows. Nightmare Creatures draws on a gothic-style horror element from the 19th century, and the game takes place in London back in 1834, when a sadistic cult known as the Brotherhood of Hecate were conducting sinister, dark experiments to take over London and eventually the world. However, while conducting their experiments, the Brotherhood tried to develop an elixir to grant them with superhuman powers, but instead, the experiments did not go as planned, and the specimen were turned into grotesque monstrosities known as nightmare creatures. As I said, the game is set in 1834, when London falls victim to many evil occurrences. Monster sightings, reports of the dead waking from their graves and attacking the living. London has become a war zone for this army of nightmare creatures, all thanks to sadistic schemes of a mad scientist by the name of Adam Crowley, who has been working for the Brotherhood. Ignatius Blackwood, a priest and cult expert, is accompanied by Nadia Franciscus to hunt down and put a stop to Adam Crowley in his quest for immortality. Ignatius Blackwood and Nadia Franciscus are the two playable characters in this game. Ignatius' main weapon is a double-ended staff, while Nadia's primary weapon is a broadsword. Each character can pick up secondary items and weapons such as pistols, mines, firebombs, and magic spells to go along with their primary weapon, which can be upgraded throughout the game by finding specific items. At the beginning of the game, the player will be given the choice to either play as Ignatius or Nadia. Nightmare Creatures, while technically being a survival horror game, it brings a dark, haunting atmosphere and a fantastic soundtrack. It is also your standard beat-em-up style game. The game will have the player fighting their way through the streets of London, battling many different nightmarish creatures while right on the heels of Adam Crowley as the story unfolds. Upon release of Nightmare Creatures on the Sony PlayStation and Microsoft Windows in 1997, both ports of the game were essentially the same. However, when the game was later released on Nintendo 64 in 1998, the game received a handful of minor changes due to the limitations and storage capacity of the N64's cartridge system. All full motion videos were removed. Dialogue between levels were in the scrollable text instead of voiceovers that were on PS1 and the Windows versions. Also, platforming portions of the game were much easier on the N64. But graphically, the Nintendo 64 port looked to be the more polished version of the game. I personally experienced this game on the PlayStation 1 console. As a kid, I remember how hard this game could be at times, when battling multiple monsters at once. But what really stuck out to me, and even so to this day as I write this script for this retrospective, is this game's atmosphere and soundtrack. It really gave this game a gothic horror feel. As you fight your way through the streets of London, this game haunts you with a dark gothic ambience that differs from level to level. But what I remember most is the gothic metal pieces that would amp up during the game's boss fights. This game's boss battles were pretty linear, with the player needing only to dodge incoming attacks and perform some fairly easy counters with their primary weapon or within the environment to defeat this game's bosses. Most ports of this game feature an adrenaline bar that could be disabled in the options menu. This adrenaline bar would drain the player's health when empty. This was put in place to make the game more difficult, and, well, it served that purpose indeed. As I recall, this being a very frustrating way to play the game. As the player, you would have to continuously seek out and win battles to keep your adrenaline bar full. But luckily, they included the option to turn this feature off, which made the game less frustrating, especially in the early playthroughs. Looking back on Nightmare Creatures, I've realized something. This game reminds me of a much more recent title, and that is From Software's Bloodborne. Nightmare Creatures and Bloodborne share a lot in common. Both games share the likeness for that old gothic London style, and both games center around combat and battles with monstrous creatures. Both games can be ridiculously difficult, yet addicting, but by no means is Nightmare Creatures anywhere near as difficult as Bloodborne. But it is interesting when comparing these two titles and noticing the similarities. Upon reception, Nightmare Creatures was a commercial hit, with global sales over 1.5 million copies. The game's success warranted a sequel, Nightmare Creatures 2, that was released in 2000, but maybe we'll save that for another time. Overall, the game was well received, especially on the PlayStation port of the game, while the Nintendo 64 and Windows versions received mixed reviews. Most praised the game's atmosphere and action-packed playstyle. However, many critiqued clunky controls and camera views as being the main issues for this game. Most simply praised the game as being really fun, but often super difficult to play. Overall, looking back at that PlayStation 1 era of games, this one sticks out to me. I always loved the game's dark horror setting, and even though I loved to play this game, it also gave me a sense of dread when I would play as a kid. The game was creepy as hell, but it was fun to play. It definitely goes down as one of my favorite and more underrated PS1 and N64 era games. This game, alongside the likes of Resident Evil, Silent Hill, is what made me love survival horror games in general at a young age. Anyways, hope you all enjoyed looking back on this forgotten title, as we took a look back on what this game was for its time. This one is a favorite of mine, and that's for sure. But until next time, this has been Nightmare Creatures Retrospective.